Good day, everyone. It's Alan Schimmel, DevOps.com, and welcome to another DevOps.com webinar. Today's webinar is sponsored by our friends at Electric Cloud, and I think it's a really special webinar here as we come into the end of the year. This might be one of the best ones you'll listen or watch this year, so lucky you if you're here and registered, or if you're watching this perhaps on recording after the fact, pay close attention. I think it's going to be a great one. Today's webinar is From Measurement to Insight, Putting DevOps Metrics to Work. We have two expert folks on this. I'm going to introduce them to you in a moment. Just real quickly, we have set aside a decent amount of time for questions at the conclusion of today's webinar. Obviously, rather than raising your hand and asking the questions, we ask that you use the question section of your GoToWebinar control panel. And if you click the little caret and make the arrow face downward, it'll expand and you can see you can type your questions in there. By doing so, your question is entered into the queue. We have a record of it. We could ask it. You don't have to worry about forgetting it. You don't have to worry about typing it later. Type your question in real time. We have it. On top of that, if the question is relevant to a particular slide or subject that we're talking about at the moment, we do have the ability to, break in, if you will, or ask Anders or Nicole, our panelists, in real time that question before it gets too far down the road. So please, type your questions in as they pop into your mind. And also, don't be shy about asking questions. Questions really do make the webinar. So please, take avail of that. If you have any technical issues, though, maybe the slides aren't advancing or the audio is a little off or something, please use the chat section of your webinar control panel. We do have folks standing by who will help you, or at least try to help you and straighten that out for you. Technology is never, ever perfect, but we do the best we can. So if you have any problems there, let us know. With that being said, let me answer the usual first question, and that is, yes, this webinar is being recorded. Yes, the webinar and slides will be available. They will be on our DevOps TV YouTube channel, on DevOps.com, and perhaps there might be a link on the Electric Cloud or DORA sites as well. So with that being said, let me introduce I'm honored to say two friends of mine from the DevOps world. First, Dr. Nicole Forsgren, CEO of DORA, DevOps, Nicole, I'm having a blank, DevOps Research and Assessment, or I messed that up?
No, that's right. Thanks so much for having me on.
Thank you, Nicole. It's our pleasure to have you on, as always. Thank you for being here. And then joining Nicole, none other than Anders Wallgren, CTO for Electric Cloud. Anders, welcome. Anders?
Good morning. Yeah, no, I'm here.
Good afternoon.
I took a swig of coffee immediately.
That's where we are, I guess, right? But welcome.
Okay.
Yeah, all righty. With that being said, Nicole, I went and did the whole DORA thing, and just in case anyone is not familiar with DORA, they are the folks behind the State of DevOps survey for many years. Nicole's recently published a great book around the ROI and the science of DevOps, the science of DevOps, a bunch of other things, and you guys should definitely check that out. And Anders, of course, needs no introduction as this longtime CTO of Electric Cloud, and also pretty well published. With that being said, Anders, we have a great webinar lined up today around metrics and so forth. Why don't we have you take over?
Glad to. Thanks very much, Alan, and thanks, Nicole, for joining us today. So, quick agenda. We're going to talk a little bit up front about kind of why we want to measure, discuss the impact of measurement, and those are some pretty compelling numbers, not too shocking there. And then spend a bunch of time towards the latter half, kind of talking a little bit more specifically about what some of the metrics you might want to consider looking at in various stages of your software pipelines. I'm going to dive right in to the why measure part, and it's really kind of the art and science of continuous improvement is what we're doing with DevOps. And as a sort of a background to that, we say this all the time. Every business nowadays is a software business. If you're making Obviously, if you're making mobile phones, if you're making televisions, if you're making, all kinds of different stuff, you've got software in it. But also if you're doing, toasters and microwaves and all of those kinds of things, we're chock full of software. And let's not even talk about cars and the, hundreds of millions of lines of code that are in the distributed network computers that we still refer to as cars. So we all need to stay competitive. We all need to deliver better software, safer and faster to stay competitive. It's really an imperative at this point. And today's software delivery challenges are probably not that different from yesterday's or even tomorrow's software delivery challenges. But we're dealing with high cost in terms of risk and time product releases. A lot of us are still operating manually, using non-integrated tool chains or maybe sort of islands of automation that are separated by wide swaths of manual handoffs and those kinds of things. And those things lead to a lack of repeatability and predictability, and also from a governance point of view, leave us with little traceability and auditability, or at least a lot of work left over to satisfy those kinds of requirements. We're many of us using our infrastructure pretty inefficiently with low utilization. We can always throw hardware at the problem, but that isn't kind of always the right answer to the question. And of course, kind of non-standard practices. Not that we shouldn't all have to, or all be able to kind of choose the processes that work for us. But the difference from software group to software group to software group is a lot. We're a lot more similar to each other than we are different from each other, I think. And then just a general lack of shared visibility across the entire software pipeline really hurts us. We don't know where we are, and so we don't know how to fix the problem to get to where we need to be, which is always tricky. And as Sam has now attributed this quote to me, if you're having trouble already, then lack of visibility is not going to help you at all. You really need to understand where you are if you're going to ask for directions to get to where you're going, or if you're the goofy analogy I use all the time is if you're driving from San Francisco to Chicago and halfway through the trip you realize you need to go to St. Louis, not Chicago, you better know where you are or you're not going to be able to kind of reroute and get to where you need to go. So flexibility is really important in this. And so science really helps us with this, right? What we're trying to do with DevOps is it's an incremental improvement game. The quality of the daily work is not nearly as important as the improvement in the quality of the daily work. And to make changes and make improvements, observation is kind of fundamental to to how we do these things in the scientific method, right? We see something, we have a question about it, we form a hypothesis, we make a prediction based on that hypothesis, we run an experiment, look at the data from the results from that experiment, and then lather, rinse, repeat. And that's really fundamentally how we consistently make improvements to our software pipelines, and for that matter, just about anything else in life, quite frankly. So science is good. So what does that have to do with DevOps? Well, like I said, DevOps is really fundamentally, I think, the scientific method being applied to software development, and making sure that we're not just kind of going on hunches and doing things the way we've always done things because so far so good. We really want to bring data and bring science to the table and sprinkle a little science on the whole thing and make it better.
Yeah,
and who better to do that than Dr. Nicole?
Yeah, I really love that back there because so many people have heard of comms, right? When we talk about what DevOps is and it's comms, right? So culture, automation, lean, measurement, and sharing, right? And that's really what we're talking about. We're talking about culture, sharing across and sharing our learning, automation. That can be automating our tool chain, but it can also be automating our measurement. Lean, right? Doing it quickly, learning along the way, measurement for sure, and having that visibility across, and then sharing, right? And that's really what's so important along all of that. And measuring the impact is what's super important because that's what allows us to improve our process and improve as we move along so that we can get better and kind of course correct as we go. Because as you mentioned, maybe we're going to Chicago, maybe we decide that we don't want to go to Chicago, maybe we decide we need to get to St. Louis instead, It's all about pivoting when we need to pivot so that we can delight our customers and win in the market. So by way of quick introduction, why do I know any of this? Why should we be listening to anything I say? I work at DORA, and DORA is the team that has been running the State of DevOps report. So that's myself, Jean Kim, Jez Humble. We've partnered with Puppet for the last few years. And so we've got this large data set, over 23,000 data points that helps me understand what's happening in industry broadly. And it's not just general trends like, some percentage of the industry is using configuration management, but it's also what types of things are predictive of improvements. And that lets us understand what's happening. We also work with companies directly to help understand what's predictive of driving performance improvements. And so often companies and customers come to me and they ask, what KPI should we be using, right? And then they'll also ask, what direction should we be moving in?
Oops,
and,
I may have just screwed up the slides. Sorry. Keep talking and I'll fix it.
Sure. So when I say that, let's come back and let's talk about, what do we mean when we talk about DevOps? When they say we want to do DevOps, well, it's not just continuous delivery because continuous delivery, right? We want to be doing these technology transformations so that we can deliver value. And so when we do that, it's using technology and process and culture to deliver value for our organizations. And so when we do that, it's important to make sure that we're moving in the right direction and not just a destination, right? It's getting better and continuously getting better, because another thing that I'll mention, or I'll kind of refer back to, is that I've been lead investigator on the State of DevOps report for the last 4 years. And what I've noticed is that the industry continues to change. It continues to evolve. We've continuously been getting better year over year over year. And so what's important is that we continuously improve and get better, and we capture these metrics in an effort to strive to get better, right, every year, and not just set our sights on a destination. Because if we just try to point to that destination, once we arrive at that destination and we stop, the rest of the industry will continue to get better and they will pass us by. And I've seen that in, I'm sorry, can you go back? We've seen that in the data. And so many times people will ask me, is there one metric that matters, right? Now, I kind of have to, on the one hand, joke and say no, right? There's not one metric that matters. There's so many things that are important depending on what it is that we're talking about. But if I had to pick one, it would be the ability to develop and deliver software with both speed and stability. Because that is the piece that is sort of your key value driver and differentiator. Because that is what allows us to beat our competitors to market, pivot when we need to pivot, keep up with compliance and regulatory changes. And this is true whether we are in a commercial space or a non-commercial space. So it's true for our governmental clients and customers. We see this is true for education and not-for-profit. And so this is what we're talking about, right? This is our direction in DevOps. Developing and delivering software with both speed and stability. And this is how we measure it. So this is deployment frequency, how fast we can, or how often we can push code. Or this is true also for anyone working in things like package software, right? Because this is how often we can push to that pre-prod state. This is also lead time for changes, code commit to code deploy, or again, in that pre-prod state. And this is important because this means that it is a business decision and not a technical constraint. Now for our stability measures, this is MTTR, and then change fail rate. Now, the important point to take away from this is that these measures all move together, okay? We do not see trade-offs. They all move in tandem. So high performers are able to achieve all of these, not just one or the other, right? You don't have to sacrifice one in order to get the other. And I think that's what's really important. So if we can drive toward these, that's what we can do. And so these are some things that are important to measure. And then also upstream effects, right? So how we get better at these are by improving our technical capabilities, our automation capabilities, our cultural capabilities, our process capabilities. And these are in turn what drive organizational performance gains. So what do we see? What do I actually see in the data? What we see are that high performers see 46 times more frequent code deployments. It's the difference between multiple times a day and once a week or less. We also see faster lead time from code commit to code deploy. It's the difference between an hour and more than a week. So you can think about what this means for you in your own context, right? What does this mean in terms of, what I said previously, right? Delighting your customers, beating your competitor to market, or serving your customers better, delivering value, keeping up with compliance and regulatory changes, patching your infrastructure faster. Now, what does this mean in terms of our stability metrics, right? How do we compare our high and low performers here? What do we see? We see 96 times faster MTTR. Our high performers are recovering in less than an hour instead of several days. Several days is really difficult, right? That's almost unacceptable now. We also see that high performers are 1/5 as likely that changes will fail. So high performers are changing, on average, only 7.5% of their changes are failing. It's really showing up really closer to the 2, 3, 4, 5% mark. Low performers changes are closer to 38.5%, 40%. So when you do introduce a change, the high performer changes are much smaller, right? Because remember, they're working in smaller batches. The code is going through the pipeline very quickly. We're working with a smaller blast radius. It's easier to identify. So think about what that means for you and your own organization. So now that we might think about where we are in our own journey and our own organization, we can think about how measurement is important, right? And choosing the right metrics so that we can understand where we are in our journey. And remember, it's all about continuous improvement. And this is why the correct metrics and the right metrics are so important. And one thing to keep in mind and remember as we kind of move into this next section is that wherever you are, it's super important to just embrace the right metrics and move forward, because even a bad baseline is so, so powerful, right? Because it can be used to communicate the importance of resource investment, right? Even if we suck at something, that's fine. Embrace the bad.
Yeah, I think even more importantly, if you suck at something, embrace the bad.
Right, absolutely. And you know what? Even if, let's say we've been measuring something and we've been fudging it for years because, we were afraid to, embrace the bad, throw it out and start over, right? Just say, we're going to start all over. We aren't totally sure if, how we were capturing it. The process wasn't clear. We're going to, wipe the slate clean and start over. There's power in that.
Absolutely, absolutely. Now, I wish there was sort of one measurement to rule them all, and my feeble attempt at a joke here is the only valid measurement of code quality being the number of what the fucks per minute. And if you've never experienced that, you've never done a code review.
Or you've never written code.
Yeah, or you've never read your own code.
Yeah.
What was I thinking when I wrote this?
Or you've written your code and you've never committed code, right? I used to write some code and my code was amazing, and then I committed my code and I'm like, oh wait, oops.
Yeah.
We've been there. We've all been there.
Yeah. No, you have to embrace the suck. It's somebody who I know who's a writer said, you have to be absolutely willing to embrace your crappy first draft, or you'll never have a second draft or anything published. So, embracing the bad is definitely something we need to think about, because, don't go looking only for the good when you're digging for measurements and digging for metrics, because that isn't really going to help you. It might be a little bit of a pat on the back, but fundamentally what we're looking for is, we're looking for the stuff where we're not as good as we can be. That's really fundamentally what we're kind of looking for. Now, what I'm going to do here is kind of throw out a bunch of kind of metrics in the various stages of the pipeline. Obviously, I'm showing this as a linear kind of progression, and we all know that this is much more of a lather, rinse, repeat kind of scenario. But just for the purposes of kind of going through this kind of stuff. And what I'm actually going to do is kind of build this out, because there's a little bit of repetitiveness, and I want to make sure we don't do that. And so really, you know, what I've kind of done here, or what we've done here, is take a number of different metrics and apply them to various stages of the pipeline. This may not be your pipeline. It may look a lot like your pipeline, or it may look very little like your pipeline. But I think there's, you know, some core concepts here that apply to most of us. Again, I think we're, as software organizations, we're a whole lot more similar to each other than we are dissimilar. So a lot of the things that obviously that Nicole, you talked about, you know, just a couple of slides ago, are here in terms of, you know, lead time, mean time to recovery, those kinds of things. I think the kind of interesting thing in some ways is the stuff on the bottom, you know, that kind of cut across, that are cross-cutting concerns for all of us. And cycle time is a big one. I had an interesting experience a couple of weeks ago. I was in Northern Ireland, meeting with a company, and they had just done a value stream mapping of their entire delivery process for one of their products. And the results of that was still on the whiteboard in the conference room where we were meeting. And it was kind of fascinating to see that almost all of the actual work being done was on the order of an hour or two, you know, 5 minutes, 15 minutes, 3 hours, 1 hour. And then in between each of the phases, and I remember this very clearly because they were using orange Post-it notes for the in-between phases. The kind of the manual wait time between each of these stages was 1 day, 2 days, 3 days. You know, there was almost an order of magnitude more waiting than work being done in this kind of, you know, say 30-odd day cycle time that they were experiencing. There was maybe 2 or 3 days worth of work in there, and then the rest was just handoffs. Which was kind of an amazing thing to see. And even, you know, the nice thing about it was they figured this out, right? They did the value stream mapping. They looked at they looked at where they were spending their time, and they just kind of slapped themselves in the forehead and said, "Oh my goodness, we're going to fix that."
Well, and that's why I love that in this diagram you've included and outlined idle time, right? Because so often people will kind of sketch out a diagram like this on a whiteboard, or, you know, I joke napkin, but let's be real, it's going to be a whiteboard. And they'll ignore idle time, right? Because we think about, well, these are the things that we do, and not these are the things that happen. And so it's so important to think about the things that we do and the things that happen, because there are things that we need to measure that sometimes we need to measure and we need to try to get rid of. And so I love that, you know, this is kind of a nice outline of, you know, kind of a generalized map of the things that we want to measure that we both want to do and improve, and the things that we want to improve and reduce.
Get rid of.
So, yeah,
I like that distinction between things that happen and things that you do, because you know, thinking about the conversations that I've had over the years, we almost always talk about what we do. You know, we generally don't talk about what happens. I think that's a great distinction to kind of push into the conversation.
Right. And
we did a survey. This is probably 3 or 4 years ago. Not a scientific survey, not a massive sample size, like maybe a couple hundred people. And the question was, for development engineers and for QA engineers, how many hours a week on average do you spend waiting for builds, waiting for environments, waiting for tests to finish, those kinds of things. And again, not a scientific survey, but anecdotally, the answer back from the developers was about 12 hours a week of idle time, just waiting for stuff.
Idle time is
QA
real.
engineers, even worse. QA engineers, 20 hours per week.
Oh my
just waiting.
gosh.
Now, hopefully you're doing something useful in that idle time, you know, other than, you know, reading Dilbert or whatever. But I'm shocked at those numbers. I hope that it's an unscientific enough survey that it's actually not true, but I'm afraid it's probably not.
But you know what? That's actually, let's like ask everyone to take just a minute here. Like, make a Post-it note for yourself, and later after the webinar, think about the amount of time you spend waiting, and think about 2 different things. What could you do with that wait time? And, right, because we're not going to ever eliminate all of our wait time. And think about what you can do in the new year to help eliminate your wait time. Because that's just time wasted.
While we're thinking about it, Anders and Nicole, just a quick question from the audience. And if you don't know, you know, if people wouldn't know the answer to this, it It would help them look at these slides better. What do we mean when we say MTTR and MTTD?
It's interesting actually, because so literally it's mean time to recovery, or in the case of MTTD, mean time to discovery. Discovery of a problem, discovery of a bug. And it's interesting because something that on the surface seems very simple, like MTTR, is actually pretty complex, because you can say, hour to recovery, but when you're looking at MTTR, you're actually looking at a lot of different metrics, right? How long did it take you to discover the problem? Did you discover it, or did your customer discover it, right? How long does it take you to get people together to figure out how to quickly remediate the problem? How long does it take you then to apply that remediation? And then do you do a root cause analysis to make sure that this doesn't ever happen again, at least for the same reason?
And what do you mean by, like, remediate? Like, what is good enough to be considered, like, fixed? These are non-trivial.
To me, remediation is like triage. It's, stop the bleeding, make sure there's an airway, those kinds of things. And then root cause analysis is, let's make sure this doesn't happen again. And oftentimes people stop at remediation, which is kind of a problem, because then, you're going to do the same thing over and over again, unfortunately. So I think, how much time do we spend on root cause analysis? And, one question I always want our engineers to ask themselves at Electric Cloud is, okay, we found a bug. We found it further to the right in the timeline than we would have liked to. What is the cheapest and easiest way that we could have found that using a unit test or a regression test or whatever, right? And always kind of keep that in mind as you're fixing problems. Is how do we come up with a strategy or a plan for making sure that this type of thing doesn't happen again? Because you might fix it in one spot in the code, but that particular pattern might appear in 14 other spots, and those are just little landmines sitting there waiting for us to step on them, and that's not a very nice feeling. So something as deceptively simple on the surface as MTTR actually turns out to be a fairly robust kind of thing to think about.
Excellent. Guys, while we're on background, one other quick question that'll help lay some of the foundational here. What tools do you use to do the measurement and displaying for these metrics?
Nicole? Oh, there's so many.
Ooh, yeah. Calculators. Actually, it's an interesting question to ask, because there's a phenomenon that I've encountered, and I'd actually be interested to hear, Nicole, what you think about this, which is a lot of people are focusing on building metrics dashboards, but they're manually feeding the dashboards with data. To me, and again, my bias, just to throw it out there, is I'm all about the automation, right? That's what we do as a product. That's what our customers rely on us for, et cetera, et cetera. But to me, the idea that you're going to manually feed data into a dashboard, to me, is like cheating, right? I mean, that data should come from the automation, so that it's true, or at least I'm
totally gonna push back at you on that in just a hot second.
Yeah.
I'm gonna let you finish.
True might be a
I just
word.
Kanye'd for a hot second there, didn't I? I'm gonna let you finish.
I know that was maybe too strong a word, but I've had conversations with companies where they say, look, we don't need the automation, we need the dashboards. And I said, well, okay, but then don't go buy a big product, right? Use open source, use Excel, for goodness sake, if you're just going to manually feed the beast. I'll let you take over there, Nicole, and interesting to see what you have to say there.
So a couple points. First, manually feeding data into dashboards is, I think, still a super, super important first step. If that is what you were doing, like, give yourself a high five, like Liz Lemon style, and be super happy with yourself. Because back to where we started, visibility is key. If you have some kind of metrics that you were collecting in some way, even if you were doing very, very basic survey measures and asking everyone, did you do automated tests? Did you do like these type of automated tests? And you're doing something, and you were sharing that visibility with the team, if that is increasing visibility across your team, and you're manually feeding it into a dashboard and it's increasing visibility, and that is your initial step to visibility, high five yourself and give yourself a hug and a pat on the back, and be super thrilled. And That should be
I'll buy
step.
that. I'll buy that. I think that's
right. Like
yeah.
for sure, absolutely, right? Because you don't have to go from 0 to 100 all at once. It should be like a continuous thing, and also that can be an amazing way to do early, cheap, easy experiments to figure out what visualizations are important for your team, what things people react to, which ones they like, which dashboarding solutions people are receptive to. Lean enterprise, right? And lean startup, cheap, easy, fast experiments. That can be a thing. Like, I'm down with that. This works. I agreed, right? Automation is going to be king, and automation is going to be better. But automation can be expensive. Automating across your full stack and getting all of that built, like, you might not have the resources to do that immediately, right? Doing that manually as a proof of concept to show your leadership team that this is valuable and everyone loves it. That's real. That's super real.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because I think there's a tension between, and I'm taking a strong position for the sake of the argument mostly, but there's an interesting tension between how much do I want to understand before I start to automate? And we run into this, quite often because it's a very legitimate question, right? Where do we start? What piece should we begin with? Because we're not going to boil the ocean, right? We're not going to leave work on Friday afternoon being waterfall and come in Monday morning and be DevOps, 100%. It just, it doesn't work that way. But it's interesting because the kind of the automate first approach, I think has, in my mind, or at least in my experience, kind of yielded the most surprises to people because they started seeing things that they weren't seeing before, just because the automation was kind of shoving it in their face, literally. Hey, why does this sit in this stage for 3 days when it's just a manual approval? Why don't you guys just get together, have the meeting in 5 minutes, and do the approval? Why do we have to wait for that kind of stuff? Unless you are into doing the kind of value stream mapping or kind of what happens as opposed to what you do kind of approaches, sometimes you end up looking at the same metrics that you always collected and that haven't really worked for you so far. But so I think there's a tension there, and I think it's a great conversation to have when people are getting started in terms of, and some organizations are kind of metrically challenged, and other organizations are quite sophisticated in how they gather and treat metrics. So experimentation is a good thing. For sure. Well, and as you said, right, like some of these metrics are non-trivial, right? We put it up here on this little box, like MTTR, right? NBD, no big deal. MTTR, it's fine. And so, like, if you can get something, right? That's great. And also, even with automation, it's difficult. And even with automation, there may be errors or there may be something, right? So any way you can get visibility into something is valuable. More automation is helpful. So. Yep, hard to disagree with that. So one thing that isn't kind of super represented on the slide, except maybe as kind of, maybe in the operate section under, kind of on call after business hours, is the whole cultural kind of aspect of morale and enthusiasm and ownership and those kinds of things, which in a separate slide deck that I do in the talk on metrics, I dig into that fairly deeply, but we should probably touch on that a little bit here at least, because that's that has a lot to do with how well you're able to do these kinds of things. Right. So how do you measure metrics? That's a question I get all the time, and I have to be honest. I kind of go to the I kind of go to the Net Promoter Survey type things for doing cultural type metrics or kind of happiness type metrics, which is I'm oversimplifying greatly there. But what are the kind of ways? What tools do you reach for when you want to figure out when you want to measure some culture? Well, so sorry.
Nicole? Yeah. I'm sorry. Just one again. I'm sorry to butt in, but another foundational question that more than one person asked is: when you guys talk about scale, what do you mean by scale?
So what I mean, or what we mean by that is basically, are you doing this for one product or for 5,000 products? Are you doing this for 10 engineers or 50,000 engineers? Because how and what you measure, really will be a little bit different when you're operating at a smaller scale in terms of complexity, in terms of team size, and those types of things. And then also how, just in general, how does your whatever infrastructure you use for metrics, whether it's whether it's a person typing it in or whether it's being automatically collected as a side effect of your automation or whatever, that's going to change as you hopefully get bigger. And that has you may have so much automation going on. I mean, we have customers that are doing that are doing 10,000 software pipelines simultaneously all day, every day. Collecting metrics in that kind of environment is a different beast than, I've got, a back-end application and a mobile app, and I need to, kind of make that work better. The scale definitely matters in terms of how, because, and also if you're a large organization, you can probably devote more resources to it. You may have people whose job it is to help collect metrics to facilitate, improving the process and those types of things. Whereas if you're, a smaller team, that may be a piece of what we all are responsible for. And this week I do a little bit of it, and next week Nicole does a little bit of it, and we kind of trade back and forth. Whereas in larger organizations, you may actually have more dedicated type resources to it.
Yep, guys, we're sitting on a ton of questions, so let's move on, and hopefully we'll have enough time to get to a bunch of these. But thanks for the answers.
Yeah, so I'm gonna fly through here a little bit to make sure that we do have time for questions here. But just talk a little bit about kind of what we're seeing a lot of our customers do. So I'm gonna just kind of flip through very quickly, and Nicole, please bounce in if when I say something dumb or smart. Kind of where people want to start looking at in terms of what do we do? What are some of the most frequent things that people start doing to get a little bit of control over kind of dev and continuous integration? Is obviously continuous integration, trunk-based development, or at least very short-lived branches. Since theoretically, now that we're almost all using Git, there is no such thing as not branching, pretty much. Everything is code, so infrastructure is code, pipeline is code, testing is code. All of those kinds of things, so that you don't have Snowflake environments. You have everything is change managed. Those kinds of things. Self-service automation tends to be a big one. That's a really big one for idle time. A big chunk of idle time comes from waiting for environment. In our experience, we have one customer, a largish pharmaceutical company. Actually, they're not largish; they're large. Where many years ago, before they virtualized, before they went to VMs, their cycle time for getting a machine provisioned with an OS was 42 days. That was the service level agreement that the IT organization had with the rest of the company. They then went to virtual machines, and right after that, their service level agreement now for getting a virtual machine provision was 42 days. So the kind of, now you had people waiting for weeks just to get a virtual machine provision, even though that machine provisioning took, 5 minutes. And the solution to their problem was to kind of look at all the different requests they had for environments, bucket them into things that are kind of pre-approved. And if it's one of the pre-approved things that you want to do, that, you don't have to go through the architecture committee, you don't have to go through the SecOps committee, you don't have to go through, all of this kind of stuff. And so that the pharmaceutical company, there's governance and privacy issues and those kinds of things. But if you choose one of the, 12 well-known use cases that we have, you push a button, 5 minutes later you have your environment, right? Whereas if you then, if you need to go off the, off the tracks a little bit, then you've either found use case number 13, in which case we have a new one we need to provision for, or you're just out in the weeds by yourself and good luck, So that's, the self-service automation is a big thing that we've seen in terms of chopping down the idle time. QA, very similar kinds of things. Test automation, again, is kind of key. I think, as part of test automation, I think, the idea that we'll have lots of people doing manual testing. That time is common past. I think we all need to be more test writers than test runners these days, because the test running will get automated if it isn't already. We've got a bunch of other thing again. As it's no surprise, it's automate when it comes to all the things that I like to talk about. So Nicole, any other kind of insights into what are other kind of interesting metrics that people might want to look at, or what some of the kind of clever and cool things people have done with metrics?
So I think I wanted to go back to what you had asked previously, right? Because it ties into something else that is interesting and also really important. And I think part of that is using surveys, right? So anything around people and culture, we really need to capture with surveys, right? Because anything out of automation, anything out of systems is likely to tell us something different, or at least kind of on a lagged basis, right? So anything around
it's garbage in, garbage out.
Yeah, or at least it's very different, right? So anything around happiness or perception around culture, particularly around, if we want to ask people what it feels like to work on a team, you just can't get that out of a system, right? Even if we get it like an HR database and turnover isn't necessarily going to tell you how people feel about working on a team. It's just going to tell you that they left the team. And even if it does tell, well, like if I leave my team, by the way, if anyone out there wants to pay me like $4 million a year, call me. I love my team.
If she doesn't answer, call me.
Yeah, I have the best team in the world, but if y'all are going to pay me $4 million, like, I'm leaving. I have known people who have left their amazing teams because they were amazing teams. Their amazing supportive team urged them to think about what they really wanted to do next. And what they wanted to do was pursue amazing different opportunities. It was actually because of that amazing team they left, right? That's totally different. Or you might leave because you have a partner that has to pursue a job somewhere else, right? That has nothing to do with your culture. It has to do with something totally different. Okay, then let's say that you actually do leave because your culture is bad. That HR database is a lagging indicator. You find out too late to actually do anything about it, right?
Yeah, you're closing the barn door.
It's too late. Okay, so then let's think about that chart that we had that listed all of those amazing, crazy boxes about all of the potential metrics that you could collect, right? Implementing all of these, as we said, is non-trivial, right? Like if you're just getting started, or even if you're partway through, this takes some effort and it takes some investment.
Oh yeah, and I think I should probably say, just to not freak people out too much, is you don't need to go implement all of these measurements even on day one, maybe not even 2 years from now.
Right.
It's more of a broad survey, so don't freak out that you need to do all of these.
Right. I mean, it can be helpful though, right? Because what we do want to do is have a pretty good understanding of what we're doing.
Yes. The more the merrier.
Implementing system-based metrics and survey-based metrics together can be a nice complement. They complement each other. And so what you can do is use people to give you insight into how your systems are running. We can ask people once or twice a year how things are running. We can ask people what your cycle time is. I mentioned code commit to code deploy. Don't ask people millisecond level information. You can only get that from systems. But people can tell you if we're pushing code in an hour or less, in a week, in a month, or every year. People can tell us that. That can give us at least insight into how our whole process is running. People can tell us if we're using version control. People can tell us if we're not using version control, right? People can tell us how often we deploy. People can tell us approximately what our MTTR is, right? People can give us reasonable insights to the, I don't want to say health, but kind of, right? The health of our deployment pipeline. So we can use people-based, survey-based measures. It can range from not scientific at all, but at least kind of a finger in the wind, to more scientific measures, right? So DORA does have scientific survey-based measures, but then we can use those to help fill out and complement our system-based measures, whether they're like fully filled out, if we have a system-based measure for every single box that you show here, or maybe nothing. And that helps us kind of complement what we have. And also, you know, capture those people measures, right? You said the happiness measures, the culture measures, the learning measures.
Yeah, we have a very large trading company customer where, honestly, just about the first word out of their mouths when we first met with them a few years ago was, you know, all our good people are leaving, especially on the ops side, because we just can't get through our weekly deployments without drama, without weekends on call, late hours, you know, kind of $1 million conference calls, those kinds of things. And you know, being a trading company, they were somewhat restricted to kind of after-hours deployments, or had restricted themselves to after-hours deployments.
So I love that correction. Yep, they had restricted themselves.
Yeah, and that was very painful because they had a lot of systems sometimes to touch in those 2 hours. And you know, so this was a thing where people were saying, look, I've been on call for 2 years pretty much continuously. You know, I'm sick of that. And it was, you know, the amazing part was actually kind of the flip side of that meeting, which was watching the first demo that we did when we showed them their automated deployments that they had put together themselves for the most part, but some people in the room hadn't seen it before. And we ran the deployments, or they ran the deployment, and the people were saying, well, when does it start? And we're like, well, no, it's finished. It took 45 seconds. It's done. And they're like, wait, are you serious?
That's amazing. Okay, so we see in all of our research that investments in technology, process, people, right? These investments decrease deployment pain. They decrease burnout. So it's totally worth it, right? I love that you had that video and they were like, okay, I don't see it. You're like, yeah, that's the point. That's so great.
No, I mean, the most amazing part was when they finally realized that it really only took 45 seconds to do the thing they needed to do. The room kind of erupted in, okay, well, if we can do that, then we can do this and this and this, and that is no longer a pain. And, you know, it was like this explosion of, I was going to say creativity, but these were thoughts that they had already had, so they weren't being kind of created on the fly. It was just all of a sudden they were freed to consider the possibility that they might be able to do some of these things. And you know, just a lot of smiles all around, which was kind of cool to see. Because I mean, this job can be a grind, right? If you're in charge of deployments and if you're deeply involved in these things at large scale, I mean, that can be a grind. That can really, you know, that's a lot of moving parts, and especially as we, I mean, frankly, as we go from, you know, kind of monolithic architectures to things like microservices and containers and so on, things get better, but they don't necessarily get less complex. And so there's a lot of moving parts there, and people are kind of happy when they don't have to sit up all night and babysit deployments or fix deployments when they fail. So that's, you know, that's always a good thing. And I actually love the idea that, you know, hey, how are you going to look at an automated system and figure out whether there's a, you know, versioning, artifact versioning? Just ask people, you know, just ask the question. I think that's kind of a cool insight that, you know, you got to talk to people no matter what. And that's the automation guy saying that, so, you know, that's a big deal. So, Alan, do we have more questions that we can cover? We got a few more slides, but honestly, I think the questions are probably more interesting than.
So I will tell you, Anders and Nicole, this has stimulated more questions.
Let's jump to questions then.
On a webinar. It's very, I have so many. I'm going to ask Sam Fell of Electric Cloud, who's been trying to monitor questions with me, to pop in here. And between us both, we'll try to get to them. Sam, are you there?
I am here. Hey, Alan. Hi, everybody. So a question just came in. How do you see AI and predictive impacting measurement and the use of measurements moving forward?
Oof. I'm a little bit of a curmudgeon when it comes to words like AI and machine learning. There's absolutely interesting things that you can discover in data if you dig into it and you do machine learning. But I guess the thing I wish that people would understand a little bit more and hopefully maybe I'm wrong about this, I don't know, is these things don't tell you the questions to ask. So you have to have an idea of what questions you want to answer a lot of times before you dig into kind of predictive analytics and machine learning and those kinds of things. But I'm also hoping that we'll be pleasantly surprised with what we can do by churning away at all the data that flies by. We certainly see a lot of it in our product in terms of just the sheer amount of metadata that we see around the software pipelines that we automate. It'd be awesome to try to pull something together there that tells us stuff we don't know. But I'm a little bit of a curmudgeon in that I don't see these things really telling us the questions to ask. But I'd love to get your take on that, Nicole, because I'm admittedly a curmudgeon there.
So I think there's promise there. I think we're way early, right? So I talk to a lot of companies that just aren't there at all, right? Like the emperor has no clothes, like they have no data at all. They're super, super early, which is fine, right? Like we've been YOLOing this whole thing, which also is fine. Like, they're so early in their software development and delivery process, or in their technology transformation process, right? We're trying to do the DevOps, we're trying to improve, but we don't know how to improve, we don't know where to improve. We need better visibility, and the best way to do that is with some type of metrics. And so now they're starting to implement. And they don't really know where to go or how to do that. And so like you can kind of take baby steps. And so some ways to do that are to look at basic things like variances, right? Where you have higher variances, you are less predictable. So let's start attacking that, right? Okay, then take a look at correlations. Which things correlate with each other, right? Okay, then take a look at some predictions, like even basic predictions. Okay, then look at what your data distributions look like. Then take a look at, and that is so many steps before machine learning and AI. And when you get to machine learning,
we're still in Excel for the most part.
Yeah, you can do all that in Excel, right? And then you can get to machine learning. And like Anders pointed out, that's not telling you which questions to ask. But even in machine learning, you need enough data to be training the data set. And then you're still dealing with questions like, are you overfitting? Are you and you need to be really careful. And are you still, like, how far into the technology transformation are you, right? Because if you're overfitting and you're still transforming your process a lot, are you training on the wrong data? Are you, it's definitely very, very interesting questions. Although I think the types of organizations that are asking those questions and they're using the data that way are organizations like, like Netflix and Amazon, and they are doing some dope stuff. That's the fun. I tell you what.
When you have that much data to play with.
Well, that much data, and they are so far along the technology transformation process, for real, they are squeezing blood out of a stone, right? They are almost in the land of diminishing returns. They are over-engineering to try to get optimizations. So, like, they are legitimately in, like, they are humming along. They're in, like, there's no such thing as low-hanging fruit. So they really are in a space where, like, they do have so much data, and it makes sense for them to try to optimize in really, really novel, interesting ways. Yeah, then it's super cool. But, like, the vast majority of people are not in that space right now.
So it's kind of it's a little bit similar to the general aspect of.
Guys,
it's kind of similar to the general aspect of 5 years ago, only the unicorns were doing, most of the kind of stuff that we're talking about here today. And as we talk about very often now the horses are doing it too. So I think, not that it's a trickle-down thing by any means, but, those guys and gals will hopefully come up with some cool stuff that we can use. But as one of my friends is fond of saying, you might be able to teach the bear to dance, but you'll never teach it to sing. So you got to take responsibility for your own data and for your own kind of ways through that.
Guys, I need to jump in here. Hold on.
Go ahead.
Let's go with more questions because we only have about 50 of them. Here's another good one. What's the best way I can use to measure idle time if my team is overseas, for instance?
Oof. Best and ethical, or just best?
Well, you know, we always like to say we're ethical, but you've not disqualified yourself, Anders. What do you think, Nicole?
I mean, idle time. There's going to be two answers here. So the first answer is that idle time has a definition, right? So it's just going to be like when you check in to when the thing happens. Now the other answer is going to be, what is your definition of idle time, right? Words have power, definitions matter. So like there is a definition for idle time. If you decide that for your organization there's a different definition of idle time, and your definition is when you check it in, but then it's only based on business hours, right? Like you can I'm going to say game the system. I don't necessarily mean it with a negative connotation, right? But like maybe that's what you mean by idle time is when it sits there with the caveat that it's only business hours.
Yeah.
But also, like, isn't that why
I think also it's
overseas is because then like you don't have to deal with, because then you have round the clock, or maybe you have overseas because it's cheaper labor. Although that's a super interesting question. Are you doing overseas because it's cheaper labor, or are you doing overseas because it's round the clock? There you go.
Yep.
Yeah.
Got another one.
Go.
Anders, I'm sorry. We're going to be populist here. What do you mean? What do you guys? We mentioned Fidelity a couple times. What exactly are we talking about in Fidelity? Fidelity of environment, Fidelity of artifact, deployment process, all of the above, none? What do we mean by Fidelity?
In my mind, pretty much all of the above. You want to make sure that you test what you built and that you deploy what you tested. And there's a definite, I would say, I'm not going out on a limb to say there's definitely a correlation between trouble downstream in the software pipeline and a lack of fidelity, say, in the environments that you're testing on and that you're deploying into. That's any sort of snowflake environments that get involved in your chain are always going to be potential, kind of thorns that you can snag your clothes on. So you want to be careful about those kinds of things. It's one of the reasons I think why containers are quite popular, because they don't guarantee fidelity, but they sure make it a lot easier to maintain environment fidelity.
Yeah, true. Nicole, any thoughts on that? I wonder, can we jump to the next question here?
Let's see if we can sneak one last one in.
Okay, and this is actually one right up your alley, Nicole. With so much data available, whether it's manual or automated, however it's gathered, how do you pick the golden thread? How do you pick the right data to measure? How do you that's hard.
That's part art and part science.
Yeah.
Yep. I mean, quite honestly, that's that's kind of a discussion in academia and in among several professionals about why you can't just automate all of it away, about why it's not just ML and AI, and why you have data science professionals. Quite honestly, that's why there are still people in the process and why there is a people, quote-unquote, bottleneck, is because at some point it still requires a person to look at it and tease out the thing that is the golden nugget.
And I think that shows up right away.
Oh, for
that
sure.
shows up right away when we talk to people, because the first question almost everybody asks is, where do we start? And that's a data question, right? I mean, you ought to be able to, hopefully use the data that you have available to you to come up with an answer to, where do I start?
Yep.
If maybe it's intuition, right? Maybe your process isn't to the point where you're, gathering data and those kinds of things. And maybe it is just intuition to start with, or maybe it's just look for where the pain is. Look for where people are unhappy or what they're complaining about, or things that are not working well, those kinds of things. But it's fundamentally a data question when somebody asks, where do we start? Because if you had measured everything, then you would kind of know the answer to that question, I think, or at least the start of one.
Yep. Guys, we're at the top of the hour. We have like a few seconds. First of all, let me say we have a written record of all of these questions. We'll get them both to you, Nicole, and Anders. And if we can get responses to everyone, we will do our best to do so. Secondly, just a quick plug for both of you. If you really want some great insights into your DevOps metrics, Electric Cloud's Insight, recently nominated for a DevOps Dozen Award as most innovative new DevOps solution this year. You should check that out. And if you really want to, get into it and where you are on your transformation and how you can help, obviously DORA's risk assessment and services are a great way of doing that, and I encourage you all to check that out. And speaking of DevOps Dozen, Nicole's latest book, her presentation at DevSecOps last year, were both nominated into the finalists as well, so congratulations on that.
Thank you.
But guys, we're at the top of the hour. Thank you so much to both of you. Fantastic, fantastic presentation. Thank you so much to our attendees. These questions were amazing. I just feel sorry we couldn't get to more of them online.
Yes, thanks everyone for tuning in.
Yeah, I mean, thank you.
That's awesome.
Yep. Thank you to Electric Cloud for sponsoring today's webinar. We'll do one again soon. Everyone, have a really Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays, whatever you celebrate, Happy New Year. This is Alan Schimmel for DevOps.com, and we'll see you soon on another DevOps.com webinar. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.